Have you ever really stopped to think about how society's future, like really deep down, connects to something super personal, like having kids? I mean, it feels like your decision, right? But there's this growing movement that's framing it completely differently as a kind of societal duty almost. So today, yeah, we're doing a deep dive into the new pronatalism. It's this movement, mostly in the US right now, that's basically saying we need to encourage more babies for the good of society. And we're pulling this from some detailed excerpts we've got from the new pronatalism, a US baby boom crusade.
Exactly. And our goal here for you listening is to really unpack what this movement is, who's behind it, what are they actually arguing, and maybe most interestingly, the kind of reactions and policy ideas flying around because of it. Think of this as your way to get up to speed on a really important, sometimes pretty heated debate about where we're headed demographically. Getting the clarity without getting buried in information.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What's the crisis that these pronatalists are even talking about?
Well, the numbers are pretty stark. The U.S. fertility rate, it's been dropping for a while. But in 2023, it hit just 1.6 children per woman.
1.6, yeah.
And just to remind everyone, the replacement level, what you need just to keep the population stable, forget growth, is 2.1.
Yeah.
So we're quite a bit under that.
Right. And it's interesting why this specific number, this decline, feels so critical, especially for the U.S. I mean, historically, America's whole economic engine, its global standing, has kind of been built on population growth. So a population that's shrinking or even just aging rapidly, that could really shake things up. Everything from, having enough workers to keeping Social Security solvent.
Yeah, and the sources we looked at point to a bunch of reasons for this trend, stuff that honestly probably sounds familiar to a lot of you listening. Things like people getting married later, having kids later, the insane cost of housing, college, childcare. It all adds up.
Definitely. And careers too, right? Especially for women, there's often a sense of prioritizing careers. Plus, less connection to organized religion, maybe fewer people holding on to those traditional family values, and just this general kind of pessimistic vibe about the future sometimes.
Yeah, sort of anxiety about the world you'd be bringing kids into.
But here's something interesting the sources really highlighted. It's not just individual choices adding up. There's an argument that society itself, structurally, has become almost, well, anti-child.
Inadvertently, maybe.
Yeah, like the system itself makes it harder, maybe even penalizes people for making the very choices these pronatalists think we need. So it's deeper than just personal preference.
It's systemic pressure.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this. Who are these pronatalists then? You said they're not all the same, but they share this worry about demographic collapse. Who are the big names pushing this?
Well, probably the most, let's say, visible one out there is Elon Musk.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, Tesla, SpaceX guy. He's been really public about it, saying things like, population collapse is the biggest threat to civilization. Strong words. And, he practices what he preaches, in a way. He's got, 11 kids now?
Right.
And for him, it seems tied to everything. Innovation, keeping society running, even his big ambitions like space travel. He argues you just can't do that stuff, can't colonize Mars, if your population is dwindling away.
Huh. Tying it directly to grand civilizational goals. Interesting. Is his tech perspective different from, say, a politician's view? I hear there are political figures involved, too.
Oh, absolutely. A key political voice here is J.D. Vance.
Yeah.
The senator from Ohio.
Right, okay.
So where Musk talks about innovation and civilizational scale, Vance frames it more around American renewal, nationalism, cultural identity, family values. He talks a lot about stable families being the bedrock of America. He's quoted saying something like, a nation that fails to create stable families is a nation in decline.
So more about national health and identity.
Exactly. And he's definitely pushing for policy changes, like bigger child tax credits.
Yeah.
He sees it as needing both policy and a kind of cultural shift back towards valuing family life.
Okay, so we have the tech mogul angle, the political, cultural angle. But I understand there are some folks taking this even further, maybe into more controversial areas.
Yeah, this is where it gets, well, it definitely raises some eyebrows. You have people like Simone and Malcolm Collins. They're often seen as leading a more, let's say, radical wing of this.
Radical how?
Well, they're not just saying have more kids. They talk about actively trying to, quote, optimize their children for things like intelligence, even fertility itself. Their goal is apparently to have as many kids as they biologically can.
Wow, okay.
And they co-founded a website, pronatalist.org. It promotes large families, sure, but also ideas like genetic preservation and future-oriented family planning.
Genetic preservation.
Yeah. And that's where the criticism comes in. Some people hear that language and describe it as eugenics-adjacent rhetoric.
Right. That phrase alone carries a lot of weight.
It really does. It sparks concerns about, promoting specific genetic lines over others, or this idea of selective breeding rather than just encouraging everyone to have kids if they want them. It touches on some very dark history, understandably making people very uneasy.
Okay, so we've got Musk, Vance, the Collinses, quite a spectrum. But looking past the individuals, what's the core philosophy here? What's the big why driving this whole movement?
Well, if you zoom out, it seems to be this mix of things. There's definitely some hard-nosed economic realism in there. There's a heavy dose of, like you said, civilizational anxiety. And then there's this element some people call biopolitical ambition, which is basically thinking about the population itself as a strategic asset, something the state should manage for its own strength, not just lead to individual choice.
Managing population as a state asset.
Okay.
And their core arguments, they're pretty direct. They argue that our economic systems, built on expecting constant growth, simply can't handle a shrinking population. They'll collapse.
And when they say collapse, what are they pointing to specifically? Well, think about things like Social Security or pensions, these pay-as-you-go systems. If you have fewer young workers paying in and a growing number of older people drawing benefits, the math just doesn't work long term. That's a huge potential source of fiscal crisis, maybe even conflict between generations.
Right, fiscal solvency.
Exactly. Plus, they argue shrinking populations mean less influence on the world stage, serious labor shortages, and, trouble funding welfare systems. So for them, having kids isn't just personal. It's fundamental, a collective survival thing.
A survival imperative.
That's the term they often use. And tied to that is this core belief we touched on earlier, that modern society, maybe without meaning to, has become culturally and structurally anti-child. And that, they say, has to change.
It makes sense that pushing for such a massive shift would, generate some pushback. How are people reacting to all this? What's the broader conversation like?
Yeah, it definitely sparks strong feeling. It really depends on who you ask. Supporters, they tend to see it as, bold, pro-future, especially when a lot of the public conversation is dominated by climate anxiety or fears about decline.
So a positive vision for them.
Kind of, yeah. But then you have the critics, and they raise some serious points. They argued the pronatalists often brush past the reasons people are having fewer kids.
Like the affordability issues we mentioned, housing, childcare.
Exactly. The economic insecurity, the lack of support structures, and also the progress we've made on gender equality, giving women more choices about their lives and careers. There's a real fear among critics that pronatalism could be used, or weaponized as some say, to roll back women's rights, to push for more traditional roles, traditional marriage, and potentially restrict reproductive freedom.
And the eugenics concern?
That's a big one too, absolutely. Especially when figures like the Collinses talk about genetic legacies or optimizing traits. That raises alarms about elitism, about who gets to decide what makes a good population. It touches very sensitive nerves.
Okay, so there's the philosophy, the big names, the controversy. What about actual solutions? What policies are pronatalists putting on the table?
Well, the proposals really span a spectrum. You've got ideas that sound pretty practical, things already debated in many countries, like much bigger child tax credits, or even direct payments, family subsidies. Making childcare free, or at least heavily subsidized, is a big one. They also talk about changing how we build our communities. Pro-family urban planning.
What does that mean exactly? Just bigger houses?
Partly, yeah. But also things like designing neighborhoods with better schools, more parks, making suburbs more walkable, safer for kids. The idea is the environment itself should make raising a family easier, more attractive.
Okay, I see. What else?
Things like forgiving student loans, but specifically for parents. More generous paid parental leave, obviously, making workplaces more flexible. And importantly, they often talk about needing cultural campaigns too, trying to actively make parenthood and having larger families seem valuable and desirable again.
So a mix of financial incentives and cultural shifts.
Right. But then there are the more radical ideas floated by some.
Okay, let's hear them.
Things like, potentially, fertility quotas, though that's usually on the extreme fringe. More seriously discussed sometimes are things like immigration policies that favor families with kids, or even give incentives for immigrants to have kids once they arrive.
Child-first immigration, huh?
That's like that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, leveraging technology, looking for tech solutions to boost fertility rates.
Okay, so wrapping this up then, Where does pronatalism stand right now? You said it's moving from the fringes.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. For a long time, it was maybe seen as a niche, slightly eccentric concern, but it's definitely entering the mainstream policy debate more and more.
And why now?
Well, frankly, the demographic numbers keep getting worse in many developed countries. And the economic anxieties about the future, about pensions, healthcare costs, labor shortages, those are getting louder. So governments are starting to pay more attention. They're looking at the long-term implications of low birth rates. And pronatalist ideas, even the less radical ones, might start looking more appealing as potential policy levers.
So it feels like the success or failure of this movement really comes down to navigating some tricky balances.
Absolutely. How do you balance individual freedom, the right to choose, with this argument about collective societal need?
Right, and balancing the optimism about technology with the ethical concerns, especially around genetics.
And balancing those policy incentives, the money, the support, with trying to actually shift cultural attitudes. It's a complex mix.
Definitely a lot to think about. So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, after diving into all this. How do you think about this relationship between your own choices about family and these bigger societal trends and pressures around population? It's something we might all be grappling with more in the years ahead.